Today's speaker, we have Mehul Smriti Raje, who is a software engineer working in Google, especially in the Google Photos application. She is a former graduate student from Harvard and did a lot of research in MIT Media Labs and a lot of initiation and passion about interdisciplinary innovations. And she's going to share a little bit about Brain to Videos today with us. So with that, and Smriti is already sharing her screen, I would like to pass to Smriti. Over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Mehul Smriti Raje. Um, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my journey to how I came into working in the brain to video domain, and then also about my other interests a little bit and the work that I'm doing right now. So this is some of the information about me. I'm currently a Googler at Google Photos, working on backend and a bit of machine learning. Previously, I was a master's student at Harvard University doing a master's in computational science with a focus in AI. So that involved a lot of math and machine learning courses and, well, cognition, which was my interest as well. So during my thesis year, I spent as a research assistant at the Fluid Interfaces Lab, which is one of the labs in MIT Media Lab under Dr. Patty Mays. And they work on smooth interfaces between computers and humans and figuring out new ways to interact instead of just having a screen to look into. Previously, I was an undergrad student at Manipal Institute of Technology in India. So I'll begin by narrating an anecdote from my life. So when I was in eighth grade, I remember we used to have summer vacations, which used to be 2 months long. And every summer vacation, we would get a project at the beginning, not just one, but many projects at the beginning. And the expectation was that on the first day that the school would reopen, you had to bring all the projects in, and there used to be grading or a contest or something like that. So in the eighth grade, we were going to have a science fair right when the school reopened. So I remember we got this, it was a free to choose science fair. So you could pick any topic you liked. So I remember I'd seen this, I used to watch Disney's Recess. I don't know how many of you have watched it, but there was one particular episode where TJ, who was the main character, he built this irrigation system where he was demonstrating how irrigation used to happen in ancient Mesopotamia. So I got really inspired by that, and I wanted to build something similar. Wanted to show how in India different crops are grown in different parts of the country, and how water flows through the major rivers. So I decided. I told my parents the same thing, and like started planning and designing how to do that. Maybe I was going to create a map and show all the rivers, and then draw all the different crops around it. And I made this huge big plan in my head. And then at the end of the first week of my vacation, I was talking to my parents again, and I realized that they had come up with a plan as well. So they were equally excited about this project that I had to do as I was. And they are architects, so their plan was even grander. They wanted to make a map of India using thermocol and put sawdust in place of the different kinds of crops, use actual crops, use sponges for trees, and make like a life-size model where you could demonstrate the whole thing. So, and throughout the summer vacation, it was as if I was battling with my parents as to who would be doing the work. Even though it was my project, I would feel that my parents were getting more excited about it than I was. And I felt that at some point they were going to delegate me to brush cleaning duties. So I had to really, I would like try to get more work in while they were at work so that I would actually be able to contribute to my own project. And I remember I also told my cousin who got excited as well. So he sent a model of a mountain of a volcano that he had worked on. He said that maybe you can stick it in one place and show how the water is flowing down, how the Ganges flows from the uphill and things like that. So everybody got really excited, and so that's when I first realized that it wasn't just the scientific aspect that interested me. It was the whole pipeline of things, like right from ideating to creating things and basically creating tangible things, working on the circuits. The whole pipeline is something that really excited me. And that was my first introduction with interdisciplinary innovation and how every single concept can be demonstrated in a way that can involve art as well as science. And this is a GIF from the project that the episode of Reese's that I was talking about. So my project didn't look like this at the end, but it was somewhat similar. Then another anecdote that I want to say is that, so when I grew up, the deeper that I went into scientific fields, the more I realized that there were very few women uh, in the fields, but also who were sharing the same interests that I was. So I used to go for IIT JEE coaching, and there used to be one bench of women, and then everybody else used to be a boy. And the same trend continued even when I reached engineering college. And I used to always wonder why this is the case. But then one summer I was interning at IIT Bombay, and we had a project where we were creating this voice response system to interact with farmers in Maharashtra. And I was working on the web interface for that. So we were demonstrating this project to some of the guests we had over, and I heard them talking about how they were building Microsoft Word in local languages so that people who didn't have knowledge of English could actually use the interface as well. And it wasn't just limited to the text that you're typing in, but the help text and also the voice narrations, etc. Everything that assists you to make a Word document. They were trying to build that stuff in so that we could have a local version of that. And therefore, I got really inspired by that particular project. And I realized that this translates to coding as well. Now, within my college, I didn't find any women who didn't know English as such. But if you extrapolate, and we also thought that, so I was discussing this with one of my friends, and we thought that programming is not just a tool to code and build softwares in big companies, but it's a way of thinking. It's a way of logically breaking down a problem into chunks and trying to fix each one of them by means of writing some logic which the computer can understand. And therefore, if you look at it, there's very few people, all the languages that we end up using in the corporate world mostly rely on the English script. There aren't any languages that at least I know of or that are very popular or popularly used that use any other script. So in order to be able to code, it is understood that you will also have to understand the English script and understand how to write and read in it. So we decided to create this interface where people could code uh, without having to have knowledge of the English script itself. So I formed a community called Women Tech Makers, and we used to work on similar ideas. So we started working on a similar kind of research paper, went to a few of the professors in the university, and then they always used to, and we were second year students at the time. So they would always like come up with these terms uh, in NLP, which none of us understood because we'd never taken a course in NLP or machine learning or any of these things. But then came an opportunity in form of the Microsoft Hackathon. So we used to have the Imagine Cup. First, we used to have it in each college, and then the winning teams would go on to represent the college at the national level. So I remember I formed a team with one of my friends, and we decided to work on this project and build an interface where you could code in Sanskrit. So why Sanskrit? It was because it is one of the oldest languages in our country, and a lot of Indian languages are said to be derived from Sanskrit. So if you look at the first image here, that is what the final interface looked like. The second image is from a picture of my team. We called it the Matrix because both of us are big Matrix fans. And we didn't only enable the platform to help you code in Sanskrit, but also Spanish and Klingon to show that it can be expanded to many different platforms. And this particular app that we built was very lightweight, such that even in places where there isn't enough internet connection, or if it's very laggy, or there aren't enough good computers, you can still use this particular app. We also ended up winning the national finals in the world citizenship category. So by means of these projects, I realized that interdisciplinary innovation and diversity are the two things that I care very deeply about. So henceforth, I wanted to pursue, because when I was working on this little project, like I mentioned, there were a lot of ideas which we were getting centered around natural language processing, but none of us knew how to implement that. Even the people that I would approach, they didn't have enough knowledge about this thing. So I was really curious about studying it formally and being able to implement it in not just this project, but many other ideas that we used to. And this was 2016. So AI was still like a lot of the research that we have currently didn't exist at the time. A lot of tools. I remember TensorFlow had just come around at that time, and I tried learning it online, but it was very difficult because I didn't have much of a base, didn't understand too much of the documentation. So I wanted to study AI formally, go to school, work on projects that will help you understand and break down all these AI problems into smaller bits. So around this time, I was also working on a job in Bangalore. And something that I used to notice all the time was that because there were so few women, it was very difficult to communicate with the higher management as well. And there would always be a communication gap in terms of how we were thinking and how they were thinking. And sometimes the concerns also differ across different age groups, across different genders. So I always used to wonder, what if we had an AI system which would enable this communication to be a little bit easier? And some ways you could do that was to assess what a person was thinking or assess what they were feeling while they were having formal communication, and a system that could aid you in saying things that would be most effective when you're, say, negotiating a salary or asking for a better project. So some kind of an interface which would bridge that social gap that tends to exist in some of our countries or some of our cultures. So that's when I wrote my SOP for Harvard, which wherein I described how I wanted to create this system which would understand the emotional and psychological aspects of a person and enable this kind of a smooth communication. So when I reached Harvard, I took a lot of machine learning courses, built a solid base with a lot of math, data science, and everything that was required. Did an internship at Spotify. Also worked with Alzheimer's data. ADNI, which is one of the biggest Alzheimer's database, is extremely extensive. It has images, tests, texts, test scores by patients of Alzheimer's in different stages of this disease. And working on this particular project, I realized two things: how extensive an AI project can be, and how many different aspects there are of looking at the same kind of data, but also how real world data can be really, really messy. And a big part of any data science project is cleaning up that real world data, because real data isn't structured, it doesn't come in a specific form. People don't function in a specific way that you can record their behavior as per some kind of a tabular structure. So a lot of considerations there were how to pre-process this data that we were getting, and also the computational power that was required to do this particular kind of pre-processing, and all the different models that you could build. What was the computational power required for all these different applications? So for my thesis here, I was looking for a lab which was working on something similar, and I found this guy called Neo. He calls himself Neo. His name is Mustafa Mohsinwan, and he's a PhD student at the Fluid Interfaces Lab at MIT. And he wanted to work on something similar. He wanted to work on an interface which can read your brain signals and use that for different kinds of applications. So together we came up with this concept of this project of reconstructing your what you are seeing using by recording your brain signals. So this is one of the research that has been conducted in a lab at Berkeley. And what they're trying to do is they record people's fMRI while they're looking at visual stimuli. And they try to reconstruct it by taking their physiological signals, their magnetic images of their brain. Now, the trick about the challenge with fMRI machines for this kind of an application is that currently fMRI machines are extremely expensive. So conducting an experiment in one of these machines is extremely time consuming, is extremely expensive. There's only so much data that you can get out of that kind of an experiment. Also, you need to be strapped in perfectly still, don't have to move your head too much around, and things like that. And people will record your physiological signals while you're in that state. So it's simple to say and simple to assess that it's not a very scalable method. It's not something that anybody can use, and it's not something that can be generalized to a lot of people. So then we came across this particular paper, which was doing something similar, but using EEG signals. So what they do is they show still images that have been sampled from ImageNet. And while you're looking at these images, your EEG is being constantly recorded. So for every image that pops up, you look at it for 20 seconds. And the way they've sampled images for this experiment is that for every different kind of category, for example, if it's a dog, they'll show you some 20 images of a dog, and you have to look at each image for 20 seconds, and so on and so forth. And then what they do is that they record your EEG while you're doing it, pre-process it, and code it into using an LSTM, and then use a generator discriminator network to use that EEG to try and regenerate the visual stimuli that you were looking at. And they got some decent results using their methods. Their data is publicly available as well if somebody wants to work on it. So we extrapolated on this idea and added a few of our own bits. So if you see on the left, we have a structure of a man wearing an EEG, of a person wearing an EEG headset, and they're watching the stimulus on a display unit. Now, while they're watching it, their EEG is being recorded, and we also use an encoder-decoder network to try and regenerate the stimuli that the person was watching. So in a way, we're trying to read your brain while you're looking at things. But we choose to, so in this, you'll see that we're regenerating the video and audio, but we chose to only stick with video. Why that is because vision is one of the most heavily researched areas in AI, and a lot of models that come up. There are a lot of databases around that. The best example is ImageNet. I'm sure everybody who has worked on AI projects has read at least one paper about ImageNet and how the data has been used in different kinds of ways for very many different kinds of applications. So we decided to go with visual stimuli as well because of the availability of data and the availability of good modeling algorithms as well. And also something else that we wanted to do was that if you remember in the previous paper that I mentioned, they are looking at each particular sampled image for about 20 seconds each, which means, and if you have ever tried looking at the same image for about 20 seconds, you'll realize that very quickly you lose your attention. You're not able to focus on what you're looking at. So we wanted to have, just like this particular paper, some continuous stimuli. Now, in this case, they have regenerated clippings from films or something which is very sequential and logically sequential. So we wanted to not but the thing about movies is that if you see the background, there's very many different objects in each image. So it's very difficult to say with certainty how much the model is able to recognize and identify each different kind of image. So these are some of the challenges that we wanted to tackle through our project. So some of the applications that we could think of is that communication, like I mentioned earlier, you can facilitate interactions, especially those in a formal setting, by assessing different people's moods, everybody who's involved. Image searching using EEG, especially because I had worked on Alzheimer's data before. I was very passionate about using that and enabling Alzheimer's patients because a lot of times in later stages of the disease, they're not even able to ask their helpers for water or to go to the bathroom or things like that. So if you had a system which was able to project on a screen what they're thinking, it would be extremely helpful for that kind of an application as well. And of course, some other applications would be psychotherapy and neurofeedback to try and focus your brain on specific things and be able to see how well you are able to focus using mindfulness and similar studies, and be able to develop a system that can help you with your mental health issues. So this was our focus. So we wanted to record EEG for continuous stimuli, and we wanted to sample that stimuli from the latent space of a generative network as well. Why that is because a generative algorithm is has a lot of representation for very many different kinds of objects, and every object that you would see, you would know that particular image had some kind of a representation in the latent space of that particular algorithm, and therefore so basically the domain of regeneration would be limited to one function. It would be the same as the latent space of the algorithm that you were using to generate the images in the first place. So you would know that every image would lie in a particular grid, and therefore the problem would be a little bit smaller than if you were trying to regenerate anything that you're viewing in the world. So that was our goal. So on the left is what the subject would see, and that's the stimuli that we generated using ImageNet. And on the right side is something that we were able to reconstruct from EEG for like some small bits. It wasn't looking this perfect for the whole thing, but yeah, this is one bit of that. And throughout, we faced many computing challenges, which I'll be talking about as I go through the different phases. So, of course, the three big steps were generating the stimulus for this particular experiment, recording the EEG, and then pre-processing and modeling that particular EEG that we recorded. So while generating the stimulus, we noticed that there were some biases in GAN. So for example, if we are trying to sample a natural thing like a dog or a cat or a lion, the image that you sample is much clearer as opposed to when you're trying to sample, say, like a table. And one of the reasons for that might be because things that are naturally occurring in nature, it can be extrapolated to state that they might have some kind of a, there might be some kind of a natural function at play as well, which is generating these images, which are generating these features in organisms. Whereas if you're looking at something which is a man-made object like a table or a lamp, then there can be n number of ways. So every picture of a table would be somewhat different in terms of the color, in terms of the structure, in terms of what is known as a table. It might be a short one with smaller legs or things like that. Whereas if it's an image of a dog, it might, like, some of the features are always constant, which is why we felt that there were some biases in sampling. So we also felt that a lot of sampling that we were doing from the GAN, if we were just like randomly sampling from its latent space, a lot of the images that would pop up would be that of dogs. And every other image would look like a dog for some reason. Uh, we also wanted, the other computing challenge we faced was that while we were sampling from the latent space, we also wanted to interpolate between them. So if you look at this particular stimulus, you'll see that one particular organism is changing into another organism. So from point A to point B, point A and B might be randomly selected, but between them you have to interpolate in such a way that, so we have to find the right FPS such that it's not too straining for the eye. It's smooth enough that you can watch it. It's also stimulating your brain enough that you are actually trying to focus and understand what the image is turning out to be. Whereas if you just put images A, B, C, D in sequence, it would be very difficult to focus and maintain your focus and hold your focus. So these were some of our considerations. But yes, while we were interpolating, we came across this difficulty that a lot of times we were using our laptops, and a video which was merely like 10 minutes long. This is a 15-minute long video, but a 15-minute long video would take somewhat 3 or 4 hours to render. Whereas, so what we ended up doing was buying a Lambda GPU for the lab, and that was churning out one video around every minute or so. So that was a good speed up. Um, and also because we wanted to generate several hours of this video, because if we wanted a lot of EEG, and since we are sampling from the entire latent space of the GAN, so it's not just a cat and a dog that we are trying to distinguish between. We are trying to identify a whole plethora of objects. So because of that, we wanted more and more data to model on. And because of that, so we ended up recording about 36 to 48 hours of EEG. And for that, we also needed stimulus that wasn't too repetitive. But at the same, I mean, we used some repetitions, but we generated about 24 hours of this kind of stimulus. So for generating that much data, we also needed a strong GPU. And like I mentioned, we ended up using the Lambda. So the next step was recording the EEG. Again, we used a bunch of different headsets to do that. Now, the thing about most of these headsets is that a lot of them are new as well. So we met some of the founders of these particular devices. So the Epoch 14 channel is basically, it has electrodes at the front of your head. So your frontal cortex is completely covered. So when you're trying to figure out, so we saw some activity when people were trying to watch the stimulus. So we kind of understood it as people trying to make sense of what they are watching. But you see here that the back of the head is not covered using this channel, and the visual cortex is at the back of your head. So we definitely needed a device that could measure that as well. So the EnoBio 32 channel was also had an accelerometer. So you'll see it has electrodes all over your head. And the most important ones that we ended up using were the ones at the front and the ones at the back, like I mentioned before. But it also had some other electrodes, and they were useful in figuring out if if there are other areas of the brain that are more effective in figuring out this kind of a stimulus. And there have been studies which only use the two electrodes at the back of the head. So we did some permutations of that as well to figure out which one was giving the best results. And we also ended up using a 128 channel one, which was quite difficult because just putting on that headset took about 2 hours every day, because these are electrodes that need to be stuck onto your head using a kind of a conductive gel. With the EnoBio, we felt was that they are doing a lot of research in this area. So they've come up with electrodes that don't need to be stuck on. They are gel-based electrodes. So you can plug them onto your head, but the person who's wearing the headset can take them off themselves. And whereas the 128 channel one was if somebody had to help you put it on, and you couldn't take it off until the end of the day, and that was very taxing on whoever was going to be the subject of our experiment. As far as the EPOC 14 channel one is concerned, if some of you want to work on similar kind of BCI applications, then you can use it. It's not super accurate, but it's good for things like obvious like temperature sensing, or sensing, like trying to distinguish between when there is more activity and when there is a rest state. So it's not super accurate, but it can be used for some of the simpler applications. So this is what our recording setup looked like. This is my lab mate. He decided to become the subject of our experiment because he didn't have hair. And I tried doing it a couple of times as well, but some of the electrodes would always move because of my hair, and I didn't want to shave it off. So he decided to become the subject of our experiment. Now we tried doing recordings in one of the offices in our lab, but what we quickly realized was that it was very difficult so for this particular experiment, it was important that we wanted just that particular stimulus to reach the subject's eye, because if there was other stimulus, it would be very difficult to isolate what you will look like. If there's always that consideration that a person might be thinking of something else while they are working on this, while they are the subject of this experiment. And that's something that's kind of hard to prevent, but the external stimuli you can definitely prevent. So we set up this tent in the middle of our lab. It's a weed growing tent, or a herb growing tent. And basically it cut out, it's completely dark inside. So there's no light and there's no sound that reaches. My lab mate used a pair of headphones, rubber headphones, so that no sound would reach him. And the only screen inside the tent would be the laptop screen. And there was nothing else. So the only activity that could happen potentially was him looking at the screen while the stimuli is being played. Again, the the computing challenges we faced here was that the amount of data that was coming in. So EEG is basically electrical signals that reach the top of your head, and which are basically representative of the electrical activity that goes on inside your brain. So now, of course, it's a continuous entity. It's not something that happens in bursts. It's happening continuously as I'm speaking right now, as you're watching this right now. So the data that is coming in is the amount of data is very high. And we notice that if you use the higher number of channels you use, the more amount of data keeps coming in, to the effect that the 128 channel one was clogging our laptop. So we tried conducting a few experiments on that. So a big computing challenge there was just figuring out how to create that pipeline so that the data could flow effectively from the headset to the computer, because it generated about 1 GB of data every minute. And that was a large amount of data. And also trying to store this data, but this is 24 hours of data. So having a computer where you can store all of that, but also having systems in place so that you can pre-process it as we are going and not have to do that at the end while you're modeling. So we ended up splitting the pre-processing parts while we were recording in the recording phase, but also in the pre-processing state. So this is in the first diagram, you see the very noisy EEG that we got. This is from all the 32 channels. And then we applied some pre-processing. So BCI has some standard pre-processing protocols. For example, removing the noise, centering them to a particular electrode. And these are basically the same kinds that you would use for any other kind of waves. So we applied those and we got much cleaner waveforms, as you can see in the second diagram. This is for all 32 channels, the average of all of them. But we also did the same for 3 channels. We also did the same for only the 2 channels which correspond to the visual cortex, for 10 channels, including the ones on the frontal cortex and things like that. Then we then once we got this EEG, we decided to chunk it into bits. So we tried to conduct 2 different experiments. One was that you chunk it into some time bits like 5 seconds or 10 seconds long, and you try to regenerate bits like that. So every in the stimuli that I showed you before, points A and points B were 5 seconds apart, and everything in between was interpolated. So we wanted to regenerate those 5-second chunks first, and then put them together and see if that was giving better results. And then we tried doing it for longer and longer periods and seeing how that was going to improve the results using some LSTMs and things like that. So we also, so we generated this using, like I mentioned, for fixed time chunks. And so here you can see that what is being regenerated is kind of chunky. It's definitely not smooth because the LSTM didn't have enough memory to also learn that point A and B were in being interpolated between, but also point A and B of the second set was overlapping in terms of the end point and the beginning point of subsequent were the same. So it was not able to learn that. And we regenerated after 350 epochs of training, and this is with all 32 channels. So we did some more pre-processing, divided it into bigger chunks. And also, if you look at this particular image, you see that sometimes the colors are somewhat similar, but they are appearing with some kind of a latency. And that is more clear when it's some kind of an organism, because the GAN was biased towards those organisms. So you'll see that similar colors start appearing with a bit of a shift. So we tried doing the shift here and applied some other pre-processing techniques. So we were able to align and the reason for the shift is because the brain takes some time to assess what you are watching. And that's why there is a shift that occurs between when you're watching something and when the EEG is able to register that. So this, we were able to reconstruct this, and at the time we were not able to generalize it too well on the test set. But this was also a simpler model. We got similar trends in the result using 3 channels as well. So it wasn't too great of an improvement, but there was definitely lesser noise. And then we went on to use bigger models for the same application, which generated better results and which generalized better on the test set. But a lot of bigger models worked well only with the 3 channels. And this was a simple FCM that we used. And something that we learned throughout this particular project formed the gist of my thesis. So I'll talk about that. A lot of work that we have done later, we have not published that yet. So I'm not going to delve too much in detail about that. But something that we learned from this bit of work was that the stimuli from generative algorithms can be reconstructed. And the reason for that was because the stimuli itself was coming from a latent space. So regenerating that was a somewhat smaller problem than regenerating anything. Now, of course, if you try to apply it to real world, what you're looking at in real world, it was going to be much more difficult because the representation is not going to be in a 128-bit vector or 256-bit vector, but probably a much larger permutation. So, but we learned that we are able to regenerate the stimuli that has some pattern in itself. So the high entropy that the stimuli itself had, and we came up with a few sampling techniques also. So it's not that we were, sometimes we picked A and B randomly, but for other kinds of stimuli, there was some pattern of traversing that latent space as well. So we use something like, so some of the walks that exist are, there's a Hilbert curve, which you can project on a latent space, on an n-dimensional latent space, and traverse the latent space through that Hilbert curve. So that was one of the techniques we used. There were some other kinds of curves that you can project on a latent space and walk on that. So what that will do is that uh, when you're picking points, subsequent points A and B, there's going to be some kind of pattern between how you're going to pick, and it's not changing too much. So we tried experimenting with a bunch of these different stimuli that was generated. And so, but something that was constant to all the generated stimuli was that there was very high entropy, and those effects were noticeable in the EEG as well. And also GANs have some biases. We tried balancing the tree a little bit. So some of the stuff that you see here, this is, I mean, here you're able to see cats, but also like some drums and some tables and things like that. But in the original data, you would only see dogs. So this is what we got after balancing the big GAN that we used quite a bit. And the future work is that to use better models. We've done some of that before, but also using bigger LSTMs, using some of the transformer networks. Also, like we wanted to do it in real time because, like I mentioned, the Alzheimer's application that is going to work well only if the system works in real time. And of course, like productizing it, but that's a longer aim. So these are some of my contact details. So through the projects that I've mentioned before, I think what I'm deeply interested in is interdisciplinary innovation and also understanding cognition, understanding how human brain works, and facilitating people to understand and read more into that as well. So I constantly keep looking for that. Even at Google Photos, some of the things that I can't give too many details, but some of the things that I work on is understanding how users work with photos and trying to build the backend and structure for that. So if you have any questions or if you want to connect with me later, these are some of my details. So, yeah, thank you.
So
I think I'd like to open the floor for questions.
yeah, no, it's great, Mehul. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think I've been getting feedback. Folks, just put on the chat any questions which you may have. We're going to open the floor, but before it open, while people are putting those questions, I just want to add a few comments, and some people have said, and I have a bunch of questions for you already. So it's a lot of feedback, very good session, and everything. People have privately sent it already. So amazing journey, first of all, Mehul. I think I can see you challenging the norm, and as you said, like women in the tech is quite a challenge, and trying, that's very true. It's a fact, and which we cannot close our eyes to. But you have been an example, and it's quite inspiring. And there are a lot of students from different parts of the world which they've messaged us that already you started back in Manipal to Harvard to MIT, and now in Google, and a lot of amazing and cutting edge work, which is like a rare case, not only just being in tech, but on the leading and cutting edge. What would you share, or what would be your thoughts to girls listening to now who are just graduating or just in college? What would be few pieces of advice which you give them based on your journey?
So something that I would want to say is that don't let things get in the middle of your passionate interests. So if tech is something that excites you, I think you should be doing anything only if you're passionate about it anyway. And that's the only way to last very long in some kind of a profession, and constantly keep striving to do more cutting edge work. So I think this project is something that I imagined doing, but I didn't, like when I started, I didn't even know what most of these fields were called. I only learned about that cognitive science was an actual field when I came to Harvard, and I attended a class by Joshua Tenenbaum at MIT, who teaches computational cognitive science. He's a very brilliant guy. And so only when a lot of things that I wanted to do, I would search for it, but I never understood what the right terms for those things were. So I think it's very important to keep looking as well, trying to understand and pen down your ideas. Keep looking for that kind of who's doing what. talk to more people, because a lot of people, something that I noticed at Harvard was that everybody was working at a different on a different combination of projects, and I was not the only one doing any kind of interdisciplinary work by far. Everybody was trying to combine multiple fields which I had never even heard of. And so just talking to people who are working on different projects is very helpful, because it helps you understand how big this umbrella is. And also AI itself is a very big umbrella, which, and I know that this term gets loosely used in a lot of places right now, whereas the applications are just not there yet. So understanding, reading the right papers about it, talking to the right people, understanding the scope of AI in its current form. So these are some of the things that help you get ahead than other people on in your field, because a lot, even people in our field, use it very loosely. So I think becoming competent in the field that you've chosen is very important, especially as a woman, because sometimes you might feel that you are being put at much harder. Your tests are much harder than your counterparts. So I think that's the advice that I would want to give.
Thanks, Mehul. And folks, please unmute yourself if you have questions, or put in the chat. I haven't seen yet anyone question coming yet. I have a next one for you. Meanwhile, first of all, I agree to your point, like reaching out to people, and I would myself through my journey, I've seen like getting mentors and who can really advise you and give that channel and continuous basis. I think it's a huge value for any person. It could be a game changer in your life. So if you can get a mentor, and you'll be surprised you may be first thinking that why would anybody want to mentor me, or why would such a senior person or accomplished person want to spend the time with me? It's not the case. People are really genuinely trying to help, especially the more accomplished the people are there. But you have to do the work for yourself. I think you can't hope them to do the thing. If you bring that point of a thing, so connecting with people, I think it opens up eyes. And I think as Mehul was saying, so I totally concur on that. I really like the way you put the anecdotes in the beginning and put your summer stories. And I think it was really nice to hear all of that and put the story. I think it got the audience engaged as well. Before I pass it to a couple of the questions from the group, while you're doing this research, I think there is a lot of negative aspect of how brain has been implicated by any kind of computer. Elon Musk has created this neural links, and there's a lot of negative talk about what machines could do. Is there any thoughts or discussions which you had through your journey when you were doing this research and all that?
Yes, for sure. So the thing about our project was that it was very person specific. So the EEG that we recorded from my lab mate is, we don't know how much it can generalize to a different person. A lot of other EEG studies with the static images that I showed you briefly, that is being done with multiple subjects. So they are able to generalize a little bit better. But then there are other caveats, like they are not recording in the right setup. If you really study their setup, you'll notice that there are many other stimuli that they're being exposed to and things like that. So there's no benchmark to assess how good this BCI data is, at least from what we read and what we studied. So it's kind of early to state how, but yes, if you really think about it, it's quite scary that you're able to read someone's mind, because that might, once this application becomes better, I think it's good that it's so difficult, because if it was easy, then it would already be exploited by a lot of people who might not even realize the implications of their research. But yes, something that we would discuss is that how to create this kind of a loop such that only you can understand what, such that only you can are able to access this EEG that is being recorded, and that required another set of research. So something that we were debating on is that maybe the EEG that you are able to understand, that is creating a feedback loop, and only you are able to select if you want to share it with someone, or you are able to share it with someone using some kind of cryptographic key, such that only the people that you specifically share it with, kind of like how Google Photos works right now. If you're sharing it with someone, only they can access it. So you decide how much of your data you want to share with, how much of your EEG you want to share with someone. Now, of course, that's something that needs to come up in parallel, but because this challenge itself is so big, we haven't really got into that. But definitely, we had conversations about how to make it more safe. But because it was a one-person data, we didn't do much work on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, technology could be ready, but there could be other aspects, social aspect and privacy and Great thing. I want to open to the floor. I think people have pointed out. I think people are coming out of the mute, so I'm going to give them a chance. I think
Sure,
anybody.
sure.
Hey, Mehul.
Hi.
Was
Oh,
a great.
hi. Yeah.
I had some questions about the brain to video specifics.
Okay.
So I had a basic question about fMRI versus EEG. I understand they record different kinds of information,
Right.
but how do the signals compare for reconstructing visual experiences? What kind of information is retained and what is lost in summarization of the brain? Like essentially, I understand both of these summarize the brain in different ways.
Yeah.
So what is the quality of the signal for what you're trying to do? How does that compare?
So we didn't conduct fMRI studies personally, but from what we read, a lot of fMRI studies also tend to be intrusive. So that is quite a big difference. And they also end up using some other physiological signals. So the example that I showed you before, I'll pull up that. Maybe again. But this particular example that I showed you before, this is very much based on not just the fMRI, in which they were trying to insert electrodes or like use some kinds of pins and needle mechanism as well. But there are also physiological signals like your heart rate and the flow of blood in your body. So they were able to reconstruct this level of images using all these signals. Whereas the EEG itself, it can be considered to be a summary of your brain signals itself, because it's only the electrical signals that are reaching the top of your head. It's not intrusive in any way. So it tends to be much more noisier. It's harder to isolate which part of the brain generated which kind of electrical signals. So definitely there's a lot more scope that you can achieve with an fMRI study. But the good thing about EEG is that it's far easier to record, and that's why I think there's some research going on creating better devices as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons I asked was to see if there would be any justification for using the intrusive fMRI. Is there some real benefit in the signal that comes through fMRI compared to EEG? Like, is it significantly better? And it looks like it isn't significantly better.
No, it might not be significantly better in isolation. Also, it depends on, I think the biggest challenge there is also that even if you're able to image specific parts of the brain correctly, or like with more specificity, it's also very hard to generate large amounts of data. So you might be able to regenerate like bits and maybe like an hour or so, but for longer periods of time, I can't imagine a person lying in an fMRI machine for that long and being able to give that much data, which can be actually used for any real world application. So again, like going back, that's a caveat you pick from, I guess.
Makes sense. I have more questions, but if there's time, I'll ask. I'll let other people ask.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have another question. I'll read on behalf of put in the chat. So Faiz has a question. I have done a similar project. I'm just reading out. I had done a project similar to this during the senior year of my bachelor's degree. I had started with EEG, but when I collected the live data, it was with higher noise. Then I ended up with fMRI data. So my question is, how did you handle or manage noise in EEG?
Yeah, noise tends to be one of the big challenges in EEG. And like I mentioned in my talk also, there isn't a specific pipeline that you can use to ensure that there is less noise. So like I mentioned, the tent setup that we have was designed specifically to reduce any other kind of stimuli. Again, if you read a lot of EEG studies, you'll notice that even in this particular study, you see that this person is sitting at his table and recording. There is an external stimuli in the form of light. There's a table that a person is touching. So all these signals get registered in your brain. If you look at the screen itself, there is a there's some whiteness around the image because the ImageNet images tend to have a particular resolution. So these are all external additional stimuli that we wanted to, which is why we think we didn't find their EEG to be very reliable, because if that's the setup that they use, then uh, there's there's all of this other stimulus that we don't know how they managed to clean. So the 10 setup was aimed at trying to remove some of that external audiovisual stimulus or even haptic stimulus. The other thing was that we applied the pre-processing that we applied was very much what is being applied in other BCI studies. So trying to fill in the gaps in the waveforms, because sometimes some electrode might move somewhere. So uh, just maintaining carefulness while we are recording was one of the basic, the simplest ways in which we manage the noise. Also recording the many different iterations of the same stimulus was helpful, because it helped us to fill in the waveforms whenever one of the electrodes would malfunction or something like that would happen. So some iterations of the same stimulus was also helpful. Again, like clearing off some of the electrodes. So like I mentioned later in my talk also, we just used 3 channels also to regenerate and use it for modeling. So that helped a little bit, because it was easier to maintain the consistency of three or 10 5 electrodes as compared to 32 electrodes. And especially in the case of 128 something that's very challenging. The 128 electrodes has a very high bit rate and it can have a very high accuracy, but at the same time, sometimes what happens is that they get 2 electrodes which are very close to each other on the head might get short circuited. So again, like there's some noise that seeps in. So I think choosing the right kind of equipment and right kind of setup definitely helps, but there is not enough pre-processing knowledge that we have, so we ended up using what most BCI studies use, so like fixing the latency and like filling up the waveforms and things like that.
Thanks. Yeah, and definitely, as you mentioned, I think data, cleaning the data is the biggest challenge. I think the noise and the aspects of it. I think I joke and comment this way, like the only time data is clean is in the training environment. When you're really trying to do some kind of training, then you get a file which is clean, never in life. So that's part and parcel. So thanks, Mehul, for adding that. Couple of questions. We are coming to the end of we have 5 more minutes. But if you have questions, you can keep putting, and we will try to get as many as we can, or you can reach out to Mehul later. A previous question, not so much on the technical part of it, but what kind of group seminars to attend, follow while living in the Bay Area for discussing research ideas? I'll let you answer, Mehul, and then I can add a little more myself as well. But if you have any insights on research idea meetups or groups, anyone?
So far, I think I've mostly had research conversations with people who work at Google. So I haven't gone on to, I would love to know some of these research avenues as well, because most of them I have with my friends from Berkeley or Stanford, or with people that I work with at Google, especially when it's machine learning in a corporate form is concerned. That's who I approach. So yeah, I think I don't know of a specific meetup. I think I usually sign up for talks like these. Sometimes I see some things pop up on LinkedIn, and that's the ones that I refer to. Or of course, like I still have the MIT and Harvard calendars. So when they have some useful talks that I find interesting, sometimes I attend those as well.
I would like to add that a lot of the universities around the world, including like the lab that I work at, because of COVID, do all these online talks and key talks and so on about all this research, and it's pretty much open to everyone all around the world. So you can find any university. I feel like on Twitter you can find people sharing links of their talks at their university. So anything that's going on in academia, you should be able to find these days.
Yeah, I think just to finally add, I think Ankit and Mehul covered a lot on that. I think it's the other way around. As I said, like right now, it's not necessary you can't find it. It's like probably the information overload. There are tons of options in YouTube's to courses and universities which have opened. It's the genuine effort, which unfortunately we have to put to really subscribe and identify the right ones. As Ankit pointed out, there are lots and lots of them, especially in the Bay Area ones. Specifically in research, I'm not sure of thing, but otherwise there are great meetups. I pointed out some of the ones which Google has. They have a good network of GDG groups like us. There are a lot of great talks. Stanford, for example, I think it's every first Wednesday has an entrepreneurship talk open to public. A lot of people don't know. You can just go to the campus and be sitting in those things, and nobody's going to stop you. and they're amazing talks and discussions. So lots are available. It's just genuine effort which you have to put to really look in meetups and LinkedIn's as well. I see last couple of questions. We'll quickly, Hima has asked 2 questions actually. Was there any statistical inference involved or necessary to convert the EEG 32 channel output to video? That's the first, and there is another one, but I'll let one at a time.
So yeah, for sure. I think when you say statistical inference, I think it involves this entire pipeline of visualizing the data, but also modeling the data correctly. So yes, there were many different kinds of permutations that we tried, because again, like the research on EEG is not that extensive. So like I mentioned, there aren't specific guidelines that this is the way that you can uh, uh, this is the one that way that you go about it. So yes, we visualize the data in various ways. We try to center it on different electrodes and see if there were any discrepancies, manually filtered some of the data by those methods, and also like try to build like heat maps of the head and things like that, so that you could assess which parts of the brain were being more activated and confirm our suspicions about the visual cortex and the frontal cortex being more active and things like that. So um, yeah, so something like that. I would say yes, different permutations of that. And I think there's a second question as well.
Yeah, so there is a second part. I think probably we'll take that as the last question, and other things we can take offline. We're reaching the hour. I don't want to hold people as well. So the second question Hima has also, do you have any suggestions for students who are currently pursuing job opportunities as they navigate through the current COVID-19 phase? Mehul, let you answer first, and I do have some insights too as well.
Yeah. I think with respect to tech, I've noticed that tech companies are still hiring. Now, of course, the visa situation is a little bit tricky for everybody who's an international student. But I do find that probably tech companies have also chanced upon this understanding that work can be done from a distance, as is going on in in my company and many other organizations as well. So just keep working on whatever you're working and whatever recruiting events you're having. I think it's a good idea to apply earlier in the year. I interned at Microsoft at the end of my first year at Harvard, and I got that because I started looking in my semester started in August, and I was looking for it at the end of September itself. So I think starting early definitely helps. And yes, if you've worked on any research, feel free to add that stuff in your resume as well. Sometimes people think that I haven't completed this project, so maybe I shouldn't add it. But I feel like it's a good idea that even whatever you know, it's good to add that stuff to that,
Yeah.
to your resume.
Right. So just add a few points to that. I think so. Yes, I think it could be challenging right now with COVID, and especially people, companies rethinking their hiring strategies and so on and so forth. But many of these things apply in general any point of time. I think it's I've seen a lot of grad students who are really good, and they have written a nice little narrative explaining about themselves, a brief. I'm sure they're sending it to tons and tons of people, but that's the right thing to do, to reach out to as many people through your network and as you can. Have a really polished summary and concise thing, and really putting your best foot forward and be persistent on it. I think just not overdoing it, but at the same time, like everybody's busy, so just sending it once and hoping that everything will come is not possible. You have to give the doubt or the busyness of everybody as well a factor, and probably the second or the third time, politely and smartly, if you reach out, I think there will be people to help you. As Mehul pointed out, it's our responsibility and burden lies on you and us to really showcase your strengths, whether it is credentials, certifications, whatever you have done. It's so crucial to put that out. Any kind of recordings, any kind of things which you have done, any kind of GitHub projects, credentials. Gone are the days where you just show a resume and write words like you want. People look for tangible links and videos and whatever code base, and I think examples of your work that's going to shine and talk miles rather than just words. So those will be a few things which I would say, irrespective whether COVID or not, that those could be helpful. So with that, I would like to continue with that. And what we'll do is like, I want to thank Mehul. This was a great talk. I think very well narrated. It was engaging. I think the whole set of audience was all along hooked to these conversations. A lot of great comments coming in. from the group. Yeah, wonderful talk, great talks, great response. So appreciate that. Keep doing the good work which you're doing. Amazing to see women shining and doing a lot of the good work already to that. So with that, we'll bring it to the end. We'll hold on for a couple of minutes in case somebody has something as well. But I think thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Mehul.